everyone! So now I'm going to take you on a tour in the roastery. So come along and I'll show you what goes on during production here. So let me just switch on the lights. And here we go. This is where the magic happens. This is where the roasting and the production happens for Thiong Hoe Specialty Cafe. You actually see two different roasters here, but we don't actually use both of them. This is a 70-year-old roaster that we actually used to use, but right now we are actually working on getting it hooked up to a computer. So electronics-wise, we are not using that. We are actually using this one. This is actually what we call a drum roaster, in which case there's actually a heat source, and we are using a gas flame heat source here. So there's actually a drum within it that will be actually rotating while you're actually roasting. So we actually measure the temperature of the beans through this probe here. And we also measure the exhaust temperature through this part. So this is where we load the raw beans. Once we are ready, we actually open the lever and the beans will drop through into the roaster here, during which it will actually be constantly turning. The revolutions per minute that it actually turns, that is also important, and that's something that can be tweaked also nowadays, because the amount of time it gets in touch with the roaster drum surface will affect how the bean is actually roasted also. So what we do is, during the roasting, this door is actually closed and you can actually see the beans being roasted through this window here. Alternatively, if you can't see, this is what we call a probe also, and you can actually scoop out certain beans to see and watch the progress of the bean. So this is a cooling tray actually. So this cooling tray, when it's on, will actually have a fan that cools the beans, and this part here would be the mixer that actually mixes the beans and makes sure that once it's dropped out, it's constantly being mixed and being cooled. And we want the cooling to happen as fast as possible so that the bean doesn't continue to roast with the remnant heat that is inside. Because towards the end, it actually can get quite hot, like 200 over degrees Celsius. So if you don't cool it fast enough, the bean continues to roast and get darker with the remnant heat energy. And once the bean is actually cooled and done, we also go through a picking process where we pick out maybe unripe beans, Quaker, some defects in the beans itself. And once that's done, we actually release the beans through this lever here. And for the smaller batches of coffee, we actually have a smaller roaster over here. This is a Taiwanese roaster. This one would be for the more premium beans where we don't actually roast such big batches of. So this one would be a 1 kilo roaster. And same thing, there's a lot of wires that we can actually use to hook up to the computer for this. Next, we go on to the packing machine. So for the packing machine, you actually see a very big hopper at the top here. So this one we can actually usually put in maybe about 10 to even 15 kg of beans. Once up there, there's actually two different vibrating, what we call channels. So we can actually tweak the channeling so that it doesn't vibrate as fast or vibrate faster, so that the actually exact weight will actually be measured pretty precisely. And finally, it will be weighed in this chamber here. So once this chamber hits the exact weight that we want, it will actually stop vibrating and stop functioning. Then we just actually press a lever and this will actually release the beans into our packaging. And finally, we reach the sealing part. This will actually be our sealing machine that we use. Usually it actually goes on an automatic belt here. So what I do is just put the bag in and it actually automatically seals up the bag. Yeah. So that is actually what we do in production. So for the first part of the cafe tour, we actually have the bean display that we have here. So all the beans that we have roasted just now in the production will actually be displayed on the shelves over here. And if customers actually want to get the beans, we actually will be able to grind it for them in the grinder that's right behind over here. So this is our trusty workhorse grinder. This is actually what we use to grind when customers actually want their beans ground. And over here we have a cashier, and yes, Glenn here is actually brewing a pour over. So this will be actually our pour over brew bar. So customers can actually get to select all the various beans, and this will be where we store all the beans for our brew bar. And over here we actually have our espresso machine. So any espresso orders like latte, cappuccino is all done over here. For this part is actually where we scoop all the raw beans for our production, and you realize that there's all sorts of different colors and sacks from different origins. So just a fun tip, there are certain origins with actually very iconic bags. For example, we have the Papua New Guinea here. So I would say this Birds of Paradise design is actually quite iconic to Papua New Guinea beans. And for example, Brazil tends to have this kind of a picture on it. Yeah. So you realize that different origins, they actually have different packing, I would say, habits in that sense. Some actually come in this, is what we call grain pro bags. So these bags actually help to keep the raw beans fresh in a more food grade safe environment, whereas some actually don't come with the grain pro bag. It depends on the origin itself and what they have access to when they're packing the beans. And some of the more premium beans, they actually tend to come in small little airtight plastic packaging as well. So we actually have beans from Colombia, Ethiopia, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, basically quite a lot of places on the coffee belt, as much as we can find actually, to try and offer a greater variety to to everyone's preferences. So after the raw beans here, you can actually have a look at the shelves up there. So this is actually some of the collection that Uncle Tan Thiong Hoe has collected in his years of coffee making. And you'll see a variety of scales and grinders at the top there. So right at the corner, there's actually quite an iconic Kalita red kettle as well. And on the second shelf, you have quite a lot of the coffee pots that is similar to what we used in the first part, where we actually did the traditional coffee brewing. And then you have some of the more like Turkish kind of a kettle as well as the very traditional kopitiam coffee cups over there. On this corner, we also have a kind of a traditional grinder. So this used to be a grinder back in the day. So you actually just put it in at the top and then just turn the wheel. It's very, very heavy. So we had to mount it up there. This calligraphy is actually written by one of Uncle Tan's old friends. He's called Chen, so he was quite well known for his calligraphy skills. So this is actually a poem that he's written on the side of this, which is the traditional cafe coffee word. So this poem is actually talking about his feelings when he's actually having a cup of coffee and what he thinks that people are feeling when they have a cup of coffee in a cafe. So basically this poem actually talks about how coffee brings people together, and at the same time, at the end of a coffee drinking session, people actually just go their own separate ways again. So it's about how coffee actually brings people together. And because it's so iconic, we actually use it on our takeaway cups as well. So this is actually kind of like our secondary logo, I would say. For the next part, we're actually going to try brewing specialty coffee itself. So specialty coffee in Singapore, I would say personally for me, something that's a bit more iconic would be an Ethiopian coffee, because it's very different from the traditional Nanyang roast that is a bit more robust, heavy, and a bit on the bitter side. This one is actually very light, very floral, it's very sweet as well. It's a very complex coffee, I would say. So that's why we actually chose to roast this as a filter coffee, because in a filter coffee you can actually taste a lot more of the coffee's original characteristics. So for this one, we're using a washed Ethiopian. Washed would be the process that it went through at the farm before it was actually shipped out to the different roasteries in the world. So for this one, we're actually going to try doing the French press method. And this one is actually ground slightly coarser than the V60 method because of the difference in the filter. So for this one, as you can see, it's actually a metal mesh. So if you were to grind it too fine like you would for a paper filter, some of the grounds might slip through the mesh and you get residue in the coffee. So this one would be ground a bit coarser, something a bit like coarse salt kind of a consistency. Yeah. So French press would actually be one of the most accessible and fuss-free brewing methods at home to enjoy specialty coffee. So for this, we actually just need a French press, a kettle with hot water, maybe a stirrer, and the coffee itself. So for this, if you want to try, you can actually just try pouring the coffee in. So the coffee is inside here.
Everything, right?
Everything.
Is that like a special grind? So like, if I want to buy like French press coffee, I would get coarse.
We call it like a coarse grind. French press would be classified under a coarse grind. So usually if you were to walk into a specialty shop, then you just tell them, oh, I'm using a French press, then they'll actually grind it a bit coarser for you. Yeah. So something like, I would say salt. You can see the grind if you want to. So same thing, I'll actually just shake it just to even it out. Same thing, we're using 15 grams here. So I'll use roughly a 1:15 ratio. So I'll pour the hot water until about 230 grams.
Okay.
The steps for it, I can walk you through. So what you need to do is actually just grab the kettle there. And same thing, just pour in 30 grams of hot water. Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. So same thing, we're actually going to let it sit for about 30 seconds. Okay, so once 30 seconds is up, just go ahead and pour straight through all the way to 230. You don't have to swirl or anything, just pour straight in. So once you're done, you can actually just use the stirrer and give it about 3 stirs. Yeah, just to make sure that all the grounds are wet. You can just throw the stirrer inside, it's fine. Then after you're done, just have to cap it in. Just put the cap on, and usually for me, I'll actually just press it a bit to make sure that the metal mesh is below the water. So if there's any floating grounds or anything, it actually pushes it down and submerges it all the way. Yeah. So what we're actually going to do is just wait until 3 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Once 3 minutes is done, all you need to do is just press down the plunger.
Okay. All the way?
Yeah, all the way. You can actually push down like that. All the way. There's a bit of resistance, but yeah, just all the way down, and you can actually just pour it out into the, yeah. That's the French press. So once you're done, actually, for all the residue, all you have to do is just open it up, throw it away, and you're done. So it's also quite fast-free, this brew method. Yeah. Now we're going to go through the process of cupping coffee beans, and there's a few reasons why we actually cup coffee beans. Number one would actually be to determine the purchasing of the coffee bean itself, whether or not to buy this coffee bean. Number two would be production for quality control purposes. And number three is actually just to actually taste different coffees from around the world sometimes. Teaching people how to taste coffees and how to enjoy the coffee. So right now I'm going to grind the coffee beans first. We're actually supposed to grind it within 15 minutes of cupping the coffee. So what I need to do is just throw a bit of the coffee in first, just to clean the grinder and make sure that there's no other coffee inside. Just to make sure that we have the right ratio. We usually cup in a ratio of 1:18, so I actually need 11 grams of coffee inside this one. The amount looks a bit off. I think it's not tapped properly. that we've actually finished grinding all the coffee beans, the first thing that we actually look out for is the dry fragrance, which is how the coffee smells like when it's still dry and no water has touched it yet. So once we've actually assessed the dry fragrance of the coffee, we'll actually start to pour water in, and the water is supposed to be at about 94 degrees Celsius. So once I pour in, I'll actually start a timer for 4 minutes. So just to make sure that all the coffee grounds are wet. So right now we just let the coffee sit for about 4 minutes. I'm just preparing 2 different bowls where we can actually use to wash the spoons in between the tasting. So for the next step, once it's actually 4 minutes past already, then what I actually need to do is to break the crust. So when you're breaking the crust, you'll realize that there's a layer of coffee grounds and oils at the top. What I'm doing is actually to just open it, because a lot of the aroma is trapped under the crust. So what I did was break it open and to assess the aroma from there. And when I'm done with it, I'm going to clear away the crust. So from there you get a clearer coffee to taste. So the coffee today that we've actually chosen to cup is actually 3 different origins with 3 different characteristics. So the one that I'm clearing now is actually a Rwandan coffee. So this one is more of a fruity, complex coffee. You get a lot of higher acidity, strawberry notes inside it. And for the middle one, we actually have a El Salvador. So Central American is a bit more medium sweetness, more nutty. It's more sweet rather than more acidic. And for the final cup, we actually have an Indian Monsoon Malabar. For this one, acidity is very, very low. It tends to be a bit more spicy, a bit more smoky in terms of the flavour. So now that I've cleared everything, I'm going to just rinse the bowls again. So usually after we have cleared the crust away from the coffee, we are actually waiting for it to cool down a little bit more so that we can actually taste it without burning ourselves. So I'm actually going to wait until maybe about 9 minutes before I taste the coffee again. Keep in mind to have maybe a cupping spoon, which is just any spoon you can find that can help you taste the coffee. And if you need to, if you're going to taste a lot of coffee, we tend to hold on to what we call a spit cup as well. So we taste it and then we spit it out, so we don't take in too much coffee. Because it's COVID-19 situation now, we actually have an additional measure because people tend to cup coffee altogether to prevent any saliva sharing or anything. We actually have an additional tasting cup that we actually put the coffee in and taste from. So there is never a contact between the spoon to your mouth and to the common coffee bowl again. So now it's about 8 minutes. I can actually taste the coffee already. So I'm going to start with the lightest one, which is the Rwanda. So what we do is just take a bit of the liquid here and slurp it and try and spread the coffee over your tongue. And once I'm done with that, I'll actually just wash the spoon in the rinsing bowl, tap it dry, and go on to the next one. Same thing, just pour a bit into the tasting cup. So the things I'm actually looking out for here would be the body of the coffee, the acidity, the flavours. If in the case of a quality control kind of a cupping, then I'll actually be looking for any flaws that the coffee might have. If it's more of a purchasing decision kind of a cupping, then I'll actually be looking at the potential of this coffee, what flavours it can offer. So while tasting the coffee, I'm actually allowing the coffee to actually aerate over the entire tongue and then roll it across the tongue to take in characteristics like the texture, the flavor, how it performs. And just to show you, if it's not COVID period and if you're just doing this by yourself, you can actually just go ahead and do this. That's actually just cupping.